Have you ever wondered why most startups, despite their brilliant ideas, crash and burn before they even take off? It's not because they lack innovation, funding, or sheer ambition. It's because they're flying a plane while still building the wings. For decades, entrepreneurs have followed the same flawed blueprint. Write a business plan, pitch investors, build a product, and then somehow, customers will magically appear. But what if I told you that this approach isn't just risky? It's a death sentence. Steve Blank's The 4 Steps to the Epiphany rips apart this myth with something shocking. Startups are not miniature versions of big corporations. They cannot be managed like established companies because they aren't executing a proven business model. They're searching for one. And that search, it isn't done in a boardroom, staring at spreadsheets or dreaming up the next big thing in isolation. It happens in the real world, talking to real customers, testing real assumptions, and embracing the brutal, unfiltered truth of what people actually need, not what you think they need. The difference between startups that survive and those that disappear into the void isn't luck, marketing stunts, or having the right investors. It's whether they follow a process of discovery or fall into the trap of premature execution. Airbnb didn't start with $1 billion valuation. It started with air mattresses on a living room floor. Dropbox didn't spend millions on ads. It validated demand with a simple video. And Tesla, it didn't jump straight to mass production. It built an expensive niche sports car to fund its future. So why do most founders still get it wrong? Why do they throw everything they have into building a perfect product before proving anyone even wants it? Because the startup world is addicted to the fantasy of instant success, blind faith in ideas, and a deeply ingrained misunderstanding of what it really takes to build something that lasts. But today, we're setting the record straight. Forget what you think you know about launching a business. We're breaking down the real roadmap, the process that separates legendary startups from forgotten failures. Because if you want to make it, you don't just need a great idea. You need a battle plan. Imagine you're about to climb Mount Everest. You wouldn't take the same route, the same supplies, or the same strategy as someone hiking a well-worn trail in their backyard, right? Yet for decades, entrepreneurs have been told to run their startups like miniature versions of Fortune 500 companies, writing business plans, setting rigid goals, hiring big teams, and expecting linear growth. But here's the brutal truth. A startup is not a smaller version of a big company. It's a completely different beast. Large corporations operate like well-oiled machines, optimizing efficiency, reducing risk, and executing a business model that's already been proven. They have established customers, predictable revenue, and processes designed to protect what already works. A startup, on the other hand, is like an explorer stepping into uncharted territory. It doesn't have a working business model. It's searching for one. And that search, it's messy, unpredictable, and full of dead ends. Take Webvan, one of the most infamous .com failures. They raised nearly $1 billion, built state-of-the-art warehouses, and created an ultra-sophisticated delivery network before ever proving that customers wanted to buy groceries online at scale. They followed a corporate playbook, prioritizing execution over discovery, and the result, a spectacular collapse. Now contrast that with Amazon. When Jeff Bezos started, he didn't build massive warehouses or create a complex logistics system overnight. He started with books, a niche, manageable product that allowed Amazon to test demand, refine its business model, and slowly expand. Instead of executing a rigid plan, Amazon evolved through experimentation, constantly adapting to what customers actually wanted. This is the fundamental shift that most founders miss. Startups cannot plan their way to success like an established business because they don't yet know what success looks like. They must search, test, iterate, and pivot, sometimes radically, before they can think about scaling. So the next time you hear someone talking about writing a 50-page business plan for their startup, remember this: execution without discovery isn't strategy, it's gambling. And in the world of startups, the house always wins. Unless, of course, you learn how to play by an entirely different set of rules. Picture this. You've just built what you believe is a revolutionary product. You've poured months, maybe years, into perfecting it. You launch, expecting customers to line up. But instead, crickets. No one's buying, no one's interested. This isn't bad luck. This is the most common startup failure scenario in history. The belief that if you build it, they will come. They won't. Steve Blank's The 4 Steps to the Epiphany exposes the core flaw of traditional startup thinking. Founders assume they already know what customers want. They don't. And the only way to find out? Talk to customers before you build, not after. This is where customer development comes in, a process that doesn't start with product development, but with customer discovery, validation, creation, and company building. It's a search for truth before the real execution begins. Before you even build a prototype, before you hire developers, before you waste a single dollar, go out and talk to potential customers. Not to sell them something, but to listen, to understand their pain points, frustrations, and what they actually need. This is exactly what Airbnb did. In the early days, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia didn't just guess what travelers wanted. They personally met with early users, stayed in their own listings, and took photos of apartments themselves to improve bookings. Every insight shaped their next move. Compare that to Quibi, a startup that burned $1.75 billion without ever validating that people wanted short-form content on a paid mobile-only streaming service. Spoiler alert, they didn't. It's not enough for people to say, yeah, that sounds cool. You need to prove they're willing to open their wallets. This is why Dropbox didn't start with a fully built product. Instead, they released a simple demo video explaining their cloud storage idea, and 75,000 people signed up overnight. That was all the validation they needed to move forward. Once you've confirmed there's demand, then you begin scaling marketing and sales, not before. A huge mistake startups make is throwing money at ads before proving they have a repeatable, scalable business model. Tesla understood this perfectly. Instead of launching with an affordable mass-market vehicle, they strategically started with the high-end Roadster. This allowed them to validate demand, fund future development, and gradually move toward the Model S, then Model 3. This is when a startup stops searching and starts executing. Once you've validated demand and built a sustainable revenue model, you can transition from a scrappy startup to a structured company. Look at Netflix. It began with DVD rentals, tested its streaming model, and only scaled once it was clear that customers preferred digital over physical. Blockbuster, on the other hand, ignored these signals and doubled down on its failing model until it collapsed. The startup graveyard is full of companies that skipped customer development. They spent years building products no one wanted, assuming they were geniuses instead of investigators. But the best founders? They search first, build second. They treat their startup like a scientist testing a hypothesis, not a factory pumping out unproven products. So ask yourself, before you invest everything into your idea, do you know it's what customers want? Or are you just guessing? Because in startups, the difference between knowing and guessing is the difference between success and failure. Think about every great detective story you've ever read or watched. Sherlock Holmes doesn't solve crimes by sitting in his study, theorizing in isolation. He walks the streets of London, interviews witnesses, inspects crime scenes, and follows the evidence. A good detective doesn't assume the answer, they uncover it. Now, replace detective with startup founder. The principle is the same. If you want to build something people actually want, you can't do it from behind a desk. You have to get out into the real world, talk to customers, observe behaviors, and test assumptions. Because the answers to your startup's survival aren't in a spreadsheet, a pitch deck, or your own imagination. They're out there, waiting to be discovered. This is what Steve Blank calls getting out of the building. GOTB, the single most important habit that separates successful startups from expensive failures. Yet most founders ignore it. Why? Because facing reality is uncomfortable. Most founders fall in love with their ideas. They picture their product going viral, investors throwing money at them, and customers lining up to buy. But then reality hits. The market doesn't care about their vision. It never did. Let's talk about Zappos, the online shoe retailer that Amazon later bought for $1.2 billion. In the late 90s, e-commerce was still a gamble, and no one knew if people would actually buy shoes online. A typical founder might have raised millions, built a massive inventory, and launched a full-scale operation, only to realize, too late, that no one was interested. But Zappos founder, Nick Swinmurn, did something different. Instead of guessing, he went out and ran a simple test. He took pictures of shoes from local stores, posted them online, and only purchased the shoes when someone actually ordered them. No warehouses, no inventory, no massive upfront costs, just real-world validation. And it worked. Now contrast that with Juicero, a $400 Wi-Fi-connected juice press that failed because its founders never asked a basic question. Would people actually pay for this? They spent years engineering a high-tech juicer, only for consumers to realize they could squeeze the juice packets by hand. No machine required. A little time out of the building would have saved them millions. There's a reason so many startups skip this step. Talking to customers means hearing uncomfortable truths. It means realizing your product might not be as brilliant as you thought. It forces you to let go of ego and embrace the unknown. But the founders who do it, they build companies that actually solve problems. Take Airbnb. In the early days, they weren't getting traction. Instead of blaming the market, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia went door to door in New York City, meeting hosts, taking professional photos of their listings, and asking what wasn't working. The feedback was game-changing. Bad photos were killing bookings, so they fixed it. That insight, gained from talking to customers, not sitting in a boardroom, helped turn Airbnb into a global empire. It's not enough to just talk to people. You need to ask the right questions and listen to what's not being said. Here's how to do it right. Don't try to convince people your idea is great. Let them tell you what they want. Instead of, "Would you buy this?" which leads to false positives, ask, "Tell me about the last time you faced this problem." If they struggle to answer, the problem isn't big enough to solve. What people say they want and what they actually do are often very different. Watch how they behave. Don't assume you need a perfect product to get feedback. Start with a landing page, a prototype, or a small experiment, like Dropbox's demo video, Zappos' fake storefront, or Airbnb's photo upgrade. The next billion-dollar idea won't be found in a brainstorming session. It won't be discovered by tweaking financial models or perfecting a pitch deck. It's out there, in the words, behaviors, and frustrations of real people. So if you're serious about building something that lasts, do yourself a favor. Step away from the laptop, get out of the building, and start listening. Because your best ideas, they won't come from your mind alone. They'll come from the real world if you're willing to go out and find them. Imagine pouring gasoline on a fire. If the fire is already burning, the flames roar to life. But if there's no spark, just a pile of wood, nothing happens. That's exactly what happens when a startup tries to scale before finding product market fit. Yet, time and time again, founders make this fatal mistake. They raise millions, hire huge teams, spend on marketing, and expect success to follow. But scaling a product that hasn't proven demand is like building a skyscraper on quicksand. It collapses every single time. Mark Andreessen, the legendary investor, defines product market fit as the moment when you're making something that people want so badly that you can't keep up with demand. It's when customers pull the product out of your hands, when growth happens organically, when your biggest problem isn't selling, it's scaling to meet demand. And here's the key: you do not scale before this happens, ever. Think about Instagram. It didn't start as the billion-dollar photo-sharing giant we know today. It began as Bourbon, a bloated location-based app with too many features. Users weren't excited about check-ins, but they loved one thing: photo sharing. Instead of blindly scaling Bourbon, the founders scrapped everything and doubled down on what worked. And that pivot led to the Instagram we know today. Now, contrast that with Quibi, a startup that raised $1.75 billion, yes, billion with a B, before even proving that people wanted short, premium, mobile-only content. They spent a fortune on marketing, partnerships, and production. And yet, crickets. No one cared. 6 months later, Quibi shut down. How do you know if you have product market fit? Before scaling, ask yourself, are customers coming to you, or are you begging them to buy? Do users love your product, or are they just being polite? Would customers be deeply disappointed if your product disappeared tomorrow? Is word of mouth driving growth, or are you forcing traction through paid ads? The ultimate test? If you suddenly stopped all marketing, would customers still show up? If the answer is no, you're forcing growth instead of earning it. Let's talk about Webvan, the grocery delivery startup that raised $800 million before it had a viable business model. Instead of validating demand with a small test market, they immediately built massive warehouses across the US. But the problem? Customers weren't using the service enough to justify the costs. Webvan scaled a broken system and collapsed. Now, look at Amazon. Jeff Bezos didn't start with everything. He started with books, a single category, a niche, a controlled experiment. Once demand was clear, Amazon expanded, and the rest is history. If you want to avoid the startup graveyard, follow this simple rule. Prove it, then scale it. If you're building 10 features, but only one gets customers excited, focus on that. Instagram did this when they ditched bourbon and doubled down on photo sharing. Test small, validate demand. Instead of launching nationwide, dominate one niche, one city, one small audience. Facebook started with Harvard students before expanding. Uber focused on San Francisco first. Let organic growth happen first. If you have to spend a fortune on ads to acquire users, you don't have product market fit. True demand is pull, not push. Only scale when you can't keep up. If customers are begging for more, if you're struggling to meet demand, that's when you scale, not before. Throwing money at a startup doesn't create demand. No amount of funding, no marketing hack, no growth trick can replace building something people genuinely love. So before you dream about scaling, ask yourself one simple question. Do people truly want this? If the answer isn't a resounding yes, don't add gasoline. Find the spark first. Imagine you're sailing across the ocean, chasing a distant shore. You've mapped your course, plotted your direction, and set sail with confidence. But halfway through the journey, the winds shift, the currents pull you off track, and suddenly, your original path leads straight into a storm. What do? Do you stubbornly stick to the plan, sailing straight into disaster? Or do you adjust course, adapting to the new reality so you can still reach your destination? In the startup world, this course correction is called a pivot, and it's the difference between founders who survive and those who sink. Too many entrepreneurs treat their original idea like sacred scripture, refusing to change direction even when the market screams, "This isn't working." But the most successful startups aren't the ones that stick to their first plan. They're the ones that recognize when to pivot. Take Slack. Today, it's one of the most popular workplace communication tools in the world. But did you know it started as a video game company? Stuart Butterfield and his team were building an online multiplayer game called Glitch, and it flopped. No one cared. But during development, they had built an internal messaging system that the team loved using. Instead of clinging to the failed game, they pivoted to what actually had demand, and Slack was born. Now, contrast that with BlackBerry, a company that once dominated the smartphone market, but refused to pivot when Apple introduced the iPhone. Instead of adapting, they doubled down on outdated keyboard phones while the world moved to touchscreens. The result? BlackBerry collapsed, and Apple took over. A pivot isn't something you do on a whim. It's a calculated decision based on evidence, not emotions. Here's when you should consider it. Customers aren't engaging with your product the way you expected. Are people confused, ignoring key features, complaining about something missing? You're working harder to convince people to use your product than they are to adopt it. If you have to beg for every user, your market fit is off. Your revenue model isn't sustainable. If your business only survives by burning investor cash with no clear path to profit, it's a red flag. Your biggest success is happening in an unexpected area. If customers are excited about a side feature more than your main product, that's a clue. Not all pivots are the same. The smartest founders don't just change direction blindly, they pivot with strategy. Zoom in pivot, when one feature of your product is more popular than the whole thing. Example, Instagram started as bourbon, a bloated app with too many features. But people loved the photo sharing part, so they cut everything else and focused on that. Boom, Instagram. Zoom out pivot, when your product is too niche and needs to expand. Example, Netflix pivoted from DVD rentals to streaming, then expanded into original content. Customer segment pivot, when your original audience isn't the right fit. Example, YouTube started as a video dating site. When that flopped, they opened it up to all videos, and it exploded. Business model pivot, when your revenue strategy isn't working. Example, Slack pivoted from a gaming company to a B2B communication tool. Technology pivot, when your tech is valuable but for a different use case. Example, Twitter started as audio, a podcast platform, but when Apple dominated podcasts with iTunes, they pivoted to microblogging. The biggest obstacle to pivoting isn't the market, it's the founder's ego. Entrepreneurs become emotionally attached to their original vision, clinging to their idea even when it's obvious that it's not working. But the greatest startups are built not by stubbornness, but by adaptability. Airbnb, Slack, Instagram, Twitter, all of them survived not because their first idea was perfect, but because they were willing to change direction when reality demanded it. A pivot isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign of survival. The startup world is unpredictable, brutal, and indifferent to your vision. The only way to win? Listen, adapt, and be willing to turn the ship when the winds change. Because in the end, it's not the strongest startup that survives, it's the one that knows when to pivot. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a massive canyon. On one side, your startup, the early days, the scrappy hustle, the first glimmers of success. On the other side, the mainstream market, the millions of customers who could turn your company into a giant. Between these two worlds is the chasm, and most startups fall straight into it. Why? Because they don't understand the difference between early adopters and mainstream customers, two entirely different creatures with wildly different expectations. And if you try to treat them the same, your startup is doomed before it even gets off the ground. Early adopters are not your average consumer. They're explorers, rebels, and risk takers. They don't just tolerate new, unpolished products, they seek them out. They're the ones who camp outside Apple stores for a new iPhone, buy the first version of Tesla's Roadster, or fund Kickstarter projects that might never deliver. They don't care if your product is rough around the edges. They care about one thing. Does this solve a problem in a way nothing else does? Take Tesla. In the beginning, Elon Musk didn't try to sell electric cars to the everyday driver. He knew mainstream consumers weren't ready yet. Instead, he targeted high-income tech enthusiasts who didn't mind spending $100,000 on an experimental electric sports car. These early adopters weren't looking for a budget-friendly sedan. They wanted to be part of the future of transportation. Once Tesla proved the demand, they moved to the mass market with the Model 3. Early adopters are your first believers, but here's the catch. They are not the market that will make you a billion-dollar company. They are the bridge to the mainstream, but if you don't adjust your strategy before crossing that bridge, you'll collapse before you ever reach the other side. Mainstream customers don't want an experiment. They don't care about being first. They want reliability, ease of use, and social proof. Look at Airbnb. Their earliest users were backpackers, couch surfers, and digital nomads, people comfortable crashing on a stranger's floor if it saved them money. But for Airbnb to go mainstream, they needed to convince middle-class travelers, business professionals, and families that staying in a stranger's home was as safe and reliable as booking a hotel. How did they do it? By adapting their product to the expectations of the mainstream. They introduced professional photography for listings, host verification systems, guest reviews, and guarantees for safety. These weren't priorities for early adopters, but they were essential for the mass market. Now imagine if Airbnb had ignored this transition. If they had stuck with a design that only appealed to couch-surfing travelers, they would have been a niche service, not a $100 billion global hospitality giant. Here's where most startups die. They launch with early adopters, see some success, and assume they can scale to the mainstream without changing anything. But mainstream customers demand a different experience. Early adopters will tolerate bugs. Mainstream users expect polish. Early adopters are willing to experiment. Mainstream users want proven reliability. Early adopters trust their own judgment. Mainstream users need social proof and safety nets. If you fail to evolve when moving from early adopters to the mass market, you get stuck in the chasm, that deadly no man's land where the excitement fades, but mass adoption never comes. How to cross the chasm successfully, refine the product for the mainstream. What worked for early adopters won't always work for the majority. Listen to new pain points and optimize accordingly. Instagram started with hardcore tech geeks, but to go mainstream, they made photo sharing dead simple. One tap, no clutter, pure visual storytelling. Build trust and social proof. Mainstream users won't take a chance on an unknown startup. You need testimonials, case studies, reviews, endorsements, media coverage. Tesla moved from niche to mass market when people saw celebrities, tech influencers, and even Uber drivers using their cars. Make adoption effortless. If your product is confusing or requires a steep learning curve, mainstream users won't bother. Facebook started at Harvard, then expanded to Ivy Leagues, then to colleges, before finally opening to the world, ensuring each step felt familiar and easy before scaling up. If you try to scale to the mainstream before your product is ready, you'll lose both your early adopters and your chance at mass adoption. If you stay niche forever, you'll never grow beyond a small, passionate audience. The greatest founders understand this transition isn't just about growth, it's about reinvention. They speak to early adopters first to build momentum, but they adapt for the mainstream to create an empire. So the question is, are you building for the right audience at the right time? Because if you're not scaling, you're stalling. Imagine your startup is a rocket ship. Your idea is the engine, your team is the crew, and your vision is the destination. But what's the fuel? What keeps everything running long enough to reach orbit? Cash flow. Without it, your startup isn't flying, it's falling, fast. Yet, time and time again, founders treat cash flow as an afterthought, convinced that if they build something amazing, the money will follow. They obsess over funding rounds, user growth, and viral marketing, all while ignoring the one metric that determines whether they survive or die. Is more money coming in than going out? The cold hard truth? Most startups don't fail because of bad products. They fail because they run out of cash before they figure things out. The startup illusion: we'll figure out monetization later. This is the lie that has killed more startups than any other. Founders raise millions, burn through it chasing growth, and assume they'll figure out revenue once they've hit scale. But here's the problem. Scale amplifies success, but it also amplifies failure. If your business model is broken, growing faster just means losing money faster. Look at WeWork, valued at $47 billion at its peak, expanding at breakneck speed, signing long-term leases while renting short-term office space. They burned cash like it was infinite. Then reality hit. They weren't making enough money to sustain operations. The moment investors stopped pouring in cash, WeWork imploded overnight. Now contrast that with MailChimp, a bootstrapped startup that never took outside funding. Instead of chasing vanity metrics, they focused on profitability from day one. They grew sustainably, with cash flow funding their expansion, not investor money. Today, MailChimp is worth over $12 billion. The lesson? A business that bleeds cash isn't a business, it's a ticking time bomb. Running out of cash is one way to die. The other? Betting everything on one big, untested idea. Startups are not factories, they are laboratories. Every decision is an experiment. Every assumption needs to be tested. The best founders don't go all in on an unproven concept. They run small, rapid experiments to find out what works before making big investments. Take Dropbox. They didn't build a massive infrastructure first. Instead, they launched with a simple demo video. No working product, just an explanation. When 75,000 people signed up overnight, they knew they had something real. Only then did they invest in building the technology. Compare that to Quibi, the $1.75 billion disaster. Instead of running experiments, they assumed people wanted short-form premium content on their phones. No testing, no validation, just a massive spend on content and marketing. The result? Nobody cared. 6 months later, Quibi was gone. How to keep your startup alive? Focus on revenue early. If your business model relies on infinite investor cash, you don't have a business, you have a charity. Charge customers, test monetization, build a path to profitability before scaling. Run small experiments before making big bets. Instead of building for a year, launch an MVP in a month. Get real feedback. If it works, scale it. If it flops, pivot before wasting more money. Track cash flow like your life depends on it, because it does. Know exactly how much runway you have left. Cut expenses that don't drive revenue or validated growth. Bootstrap when possible. The best companies, MailChimp, Basecamp, Calendly, grew without relying on VC money. Raising capital isn't bad, but burning through it without a sustainable plan is lethal. Adapt, adapt, adapt. If your product isn't selling, tweak the offer. If customers aren't converting, test new messaging. The best startups evolve constantly, staying ahead of problems before they become fatal. Every great startup has one thing in common. They didn't run out of money before they figured it out. Google, Facebook, Airbnb, Tesla, none of them got everything right the first time. But they survived long enough to experiment, pivot, and find the winning formula. So before you chase funding, before you burn cash on flashy marketing, before you assume everything will just work, ask yourself, are we making enough money to survive? Are we testing before we invest? Are we treating this like a lab, not a gamble? Because in the end, the startups that win aren't the ones that burn the brightest. They're the ones that stay in the game long enough to get it right.